What would you do if you had exactly $215 left to your name, a foreclosure notice taped to your front door, and someone offered you a crumbling, condemned factory that the entire county considered a biohazard for a starting bid of $215? Most people would walk away. Ruth Calloway was not most people. But she wasn't brave either, not that Tuesday morning. She was just too exhausted to be sensible anymore. Ruth Ann Calloway, 63, had spent 31 years delivering mail through the same 12-mile rural route outside Harlan County, Kentucky. She had walked that route in August heat and January ice, through dog bites and creek floods, and one memorable afternoon when a black bear had calmly helped itself to 3 packages on Mrs. Gentry's front porch while Ruth stood 12 feet away, completely frozen, clutching a certified letter for a woman who was already watching from her kitchen window. She had survived all of it. She had raised a son mostly alone, while her husband, Gerald, worked 60-hour weeks at a cabinet shop to keep the lights on. She had helped Gerald through 2 back surgeries and a knee replacement, and, finally, the massive hemorrhagic stroke that took him from her in 9 minutes on a Tuesday evening in February, while the television played a rerun of a cooking show neither of them had ever liked. 5 months. That was how long Ruth had been a widow when she drove her 2007 Chevy Silverado into the parking lot of the Harlan County Courthouse at 7:45 in the morning, trying to hold herself together with the same quiet stubbornness she had used to hold everything else together her entire life. She was not there for the auction. Her nephew, Dale, had mentioned a week earlier that the county clerk's office was hiring a part-time records assistant, 19 hours a week, $12 an hour. It was not glamorous. It was not what a woman with 31 years of federal service should have been applying for. But Gerald's final hospitalization, 4 days in the ICU at the University of Kentucky Medical Center, had generated $187,000 in bills that their insurance had covered in the approximate way a paper umbrella covers a person standing in a hurricane. The small ranch house on Crossfield Road, where they had lived for 22 years, was 6 weeks from being transferred to the bank. Ruth's monthly survivor's pension covered roughly half her mortgage payment. The math did not work. It had not worked for 5 months, and no amount of spreadsheet revision was going to change that. She had ironed her good blouse the night before, the navy one with the small pearl buttons she had bought at JCPenney in 2019 for Gerald's retirement dinner at the cabinet shop. She had worn it twice since. She was wearing it now, driving toward a job that, as the girl at the front desk of the clerk's office informed her with genuine but entirely unhelpful sympathy, had been filled internally on Friday. "I'm so sorry, we should have updated the posting." Ruth thanked her. She walked back out into the hallway and stood there a moment, looking at the bulletin board with its notices and auction announcements, the floor beneath her good shoes cold and echoey, and she made the only rational decision available. She found the nearest open door and sat down inside it. The room was a wood-paneled assembly hall that smelled of old carpet and window unit air conditioning. Folding chairs had been arranged in uneven rows, facing a raised platform where a man named Clyde Ferris was conducting the monthly tax deed sale, with the energy of someone reading nutritional information off a cereal box. There were maybe 20 people in the room. Local investors, a few land speculators in clean boots, a woman from the county assessor's office tapping something into a laptop. Ruth took a seat in the back row near the door, primarily because the walk back to the parking lot in the July heat sounded, at that particular moment, like more than she could manage. She had not planned to stay. She had not planned to listen. She certainly had not planned to raise her hand. Ferris worked through the list methodically. Stripped residential lots, a foreclosed double-wide, a stretch of bottomland that flooded every spring without fail. The crowd murmured and shifted. Paddles went up and came down. Ruth watched without really seeing any of it, her navy blouse slightly too warm, her good shoes slightly too tight, thinking about how she was going to tell Gerald's sister Carol that she might need to ask about the spare room in Carol's house in Lexington, and how much she did not want to make that call. "Moving on," Ferris said, squinting at his clipboard. "Lot 312, commercial and industrial parcel. 11 acres, Highway 421 corridor near Bledsoe Creek. This is the old Aldrich textile property. Existing structure, approximately 68,000 square feet. Concrete and masonry construction, circa 1941. County holds the deed following non-payment of property taxes spanning 14 consecutive years. Starting bid is $215, representing the outstanding administrative lien and filing costs. Do I have a bid at $215? A man in the third row, a heavyset contractor named Bud Simmons, who had been buying distressed industrial properties in the area for 20 years, actually laughed. Not unkindly, just the reflexive, knowing laugh of someone who recognized a beautiful catastrophe when he saw one. "Bud, you want it?" Ferris asked, in the tone of a man who already knew the answer. "Lord, no," Bud said, still chuckling. "That place has got more asbestos per square foot than a 1970s elementary school. I drove out there last spring. The east wall is listing about 12 degrees. She's going to fall on her own inside of 2 years." Ferris nodded as if this confirmed exactly what he'd expected. $215 on the Aldrich textile. "Do I have any interest at all?" The room was quiet. Ruth looked at her purse, a sensible brown leather bag she'd owned since 2011. Inside it was a wallet holding $215 in cash, the last of the money from selling Gerald's woodworking tools to a shop in Pineville, and a debit card connected to an account that currently held $11.47. She had been planning to use the $215 for groceries and the electric bill. She thought about Gerald. He used to say, teaching their son how to work with lumber, that the most important lesson in carpentry was knowing the difference between wood that was ruined and wood that just looked ruined. "Most people give up on a board because it looks bad," he'd say. "But you run your hand along the grain first. You check what's underneath." Ruth's hand went up before she had consciously decided to raise it. Ferris stared at her. Bud Simmons turned around in his chair to look at her with an expression of mild bewilderment. The way you might look at someone who had just announced they were going to walk to Cleveland. "I have a bid," Ferris said carefully, as if making sure he wasn't imagining it. $215 from the lady in the back. "Ma'am, I'm required to inform you that Lot 312 carries a county environmental assessment notice and an open structural condemnation order from 2019. "I understand," Ruth said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. Going once. Ferris looked around the room. Nobody moved. Going twice. He glanced at Bud Simmons, who shook his head fractionally. "Sold. Lot 312, Aldrich Textile, to the lady in the back for $215. Ruth walked down to the clerk's table on legs that felt slightly separate from the rest of her body. She handed over 11 $20 bills and a 5, signed her name on 4 different forms she did not fully read, and walked back out into the July heat as the new owner of a condemned, asbestos-riddled, 11-acre industrial ruin that no one else had wanted for 14 years. In the parking lot, she sat in the Silverado with the engine off and the windows up, and she let herself cry for exactly 4 minutes. Then she started the truck. The copper pipes in a building that size, she reasoned, had to be worth at least a few $100s at the scrapyard. Maybe more if the roof had held over the years. It was not a plan so much as a direction, and a direction was something. She was going to the Aldrich Mill. The property sat about 6 miles north of town, set back from Highway 421 behind a windbreak of overgrown cedar trees that had long since made the building nearly invisible from the road. The gravel access drive was cracked and heaved and patchy with weeds, but it held under the truck's tires. Ruth parked in what had once been an employee lot and stepped out into the thick, humid afternoon. The mill was enormous. Even listing slightly to the east, as Bud had described, it was an imposing structure, 4 stories of pale yellow brick gone grey with time, its windows either bricked over or covered with plywood sheets warped from decades of weather. A faded sign above the loading dock read Aldrich Textile Company in black letters. The paint cracked into a mosaic. Kudzu had colonized the southeast corner of the building and was making its way steadily across the roofline. The parking lot was a prairie of knee-high grass pushing through fractured asphalt. Ruth tied a cotton bandana over her face, clipped a utility light to her belt, and pried open a loading dock side door that gave way after about 30 seconds of persuasion with the crowbar she kept in the truck bed. Inside, the air was decades old, heavy and still, layered with must and machine oil, and something sharper underneath that she couldn't name. She clicked on the utility light. The beam caught the spinning motes of dust she'd disturbed, and beyond them, the vast, shadowed floor of the main production hall. It was the largest interior space Ruth had ever stood in that wasn't a stadium. Rows of industrial looms, cast-iron machines 12 feet high, that probably hadn't moved since the Clinton administration, stood in the semi-darkness like a petrified forest. Fabric remnants still hung from some of the frames, grey and eaten through by time. The concrete floor was filmed with grime and broken glass, and in one corner an impressive colony of pigeons erupted upward in a thundering, rattling panic when Ruth's light swept their direction, sending her heart directly into her throat. She spent the next 2 hours working methodically through the ground floor, pulling access panels, tracing pipe runs, checking the mechanical room at the back of the building. The news was not good. A scrap crew had been through here, recently enough, relative to the building's age, that the entry probably dated to the mid-2000s based on what they'd left behind. The copper had been stripped so thoroughly that someone had even taken the fittings off the sprinkler system. What remained was cast iron and galvanized steel, worth considerably less. By 7 in the evening, Ruth had accumulated approximately $40 worth of salvageable metal, a wrenched shoulder, and a comprehensive understanding of why no one else had bid $215 on this property. She sat down on a crate in the mechanical room and drank the last of her water, trying to assess her situation with the same pragmatism she'd applied to bad routes and bad weather for 3 decades. She had made a mistake, not an unfixable one. She still owned 11 acres of land that, asbestos notwithstanding, had some residual value. She could talk to someone at the county about remediation programs. She could. And at that thought, the Silverado suddenly became relevant to her situation in a new way, because she could hear rain starting outside, a rising hiss against the brick walls, and then the deeper, more ominous sound of thunder that had apparently been building while she was inside. Ruth walked back to the loading dock door and looked out at a Kentucky summer storm, arriving with the kind of conviction that made you understand why the region's creek beds were so well defined. The gravel drive was already running water. She could see it from the dock, a shallow but fast-moving sheet across the low point of the access road, where the culvert under the driveway occasionally overwhelmed in heavy rain. She had noticed the water staining on the culvert headwall when she drove in. She had not, at the time, considered it meaningful. It was meaningful now. She was not driving back through that in the dark, in a rainstorm, on tires that were due for replacement. She knew her truck, and she knew her limitations. She was going to wait this out. Ruth went looking for the offices. In most old industrial buildings, the management offices occupied one end of the structure, a separate, more finished set of rooms tucked behind the production floor. She found the stairwell in the northeast corner and climbed to the second floor, where a wide corridor ran behind a row of frosted glass windows that once looked down onto the loom floor. Several doors were still stenciled: Invi, Floor Supervisor, Personnel. At the end of the corridor was a door simply labeled Manageden. Unlike the rest of the building, which had been opened to the elements and looted accordingly, the management suite was remarkably intact. A dropped ceiling had held, keeping the rain out. The floor was dusty but unbroken. The furniture was still there. A heavy walnut desk that would have cost real money in 1965, Two upholstered chairs in the dark green fabric you only saw in photographs from that era, and on the wall behind the desk, a large framed portrait of a man in a double-breasted suit, stern-faced and prosperous-looking, with a brass plate reading Harold B. Aldrich, founder, 1941. Ruth pulled one of the green chairs into the corner away from the window, sat down, and took the small blue and silver torpedo level from her coat pocket. It had been Gerald's. He had carried it in his shirt pocket for most of their marriage, the way other men carried pens, a 6-inch level, small and precise and worn smooth on one side from 30-some years of reaching in and out of the same pocket. When they cleaned out his things, their son Kevin had wanted the big stuff, the hand planes and chisels and the shop apron. Ruth had kept the level. She didn't know why, exactly. It was small enough to carry without thinking about it, and she liked having something to hold when she needed to think. She held it now, rolling it gently between her palms in the dark, listening to the rain. She was nearly asleep when the floor moved. That was how it felt. Not a sound exactly, more a vibration that traveled up through the chair legs and into her spine, a deep mechanical shudder somewhere directly beneath her feet, followed by a grinding noise that was unmistakably the sound of something large and metal moving against something else large and metal. Ruth was fully awake and standing before she had consciously processed what she'd heard. The grinding stopped. The room was quiet except for the rain. Then it happened again, slower this time. A deliberate series of mechanical clicks, evenly spaced, coming from directly beneath the walnut desk. Ruth stood completely still, her hand wrapped around the crowbar she had instinctively picked up when she stood. The clicking stopped, silence, then a heavy, resonant clunk, like a deadbolt the size of a man's forearm dropping into a receiver somewhere deep in the building's bones. Ruth did not believe in haunted buildings. She believed in structural settling, in animals, in pipes contracting and expanding with temperature change. But whatever was happening under that desk was none of those things. It was a mechanism, controlled, sequential. She crossed the room slowly and lowered herself onto one knee, shining the light underneath. The dust on the floor was disturbed. Not recently, maybe weeks or months ago, but clearly someone had been on their hands and knees in this exact spot. Drag marks in the grime led to the wall behind the desk, to the section directly below the portrait of Harold B. Aldrich. Ruth stood and lifted the portrait off the wall. Behind it was a recessed metal panel, roughly 14 inches square, painted the same cream color as the surrounding wall, and fitted seamlessly into the plaster. She would never have noticed it if she hadn't been looking at floor level. In the center of the panel was a small circular opening, maybe the diameter of a finger. Not a keyhole, a slot, horizontal like the coin slot on a vending machine. Ruth went back to the desk and opened each drawer. Office detritus, paper clips, dried-up pens, stapler missing its staples, a 1988 desk calendar, with the last entry written on July 14th. A date. She noted distantly 38 years to the month before today. In the back of the bottom right drawer, wrapped in a piece of cloth that had once been a handkerchief, was a coin. Not a regular coin, a heavy disc of what appeared to be solid silver, slightly larger than a $50, with no denomination and no national seal. One side was stamped Aldrich Textile Co., Harlan KY. The other showed a loom shuttle and the year 1941, the mill's founding date. A commemorative token, probably from opening day, the kind of thing that went into a shadow box and got forgotten in a desk drawer for 6 decades. Ruth walked back to the panel and fit the token into the slot. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the building came alive. The grinding she'd heard earlier was now directly in front of her, louder, unmistakable. A gear train engaging, a counterweight moving through a shaft. The wall beneath the portrait shuddered. The plaster cracked along a vertical seam she now understood was not a crack at all, but a door frame. Slowly, with the profound reluctance of something that hadn't moved in nearly 4 decades, a 5-foot section of wall swung backward and to the right. Cold air moved across Ruth's face. Not the stale, chemical air of the mill, but something colder, drier, more enclosed, the kind of air that lived in the dark. Ruth held the crowbar in her right hand and the light in her left and stepped through the opening. The passage was narrow, barely wide enough for two people, and made of poured concrete rather than brick, which meant it had been planned from the building's original construction. It ran about 20 feet before ending at a steel vault door, ajar. A large wheel lock hung unlocked in the center, turned to the open position. Someone had been here, recently enough that Ruth could see a partial boot print in the dust before the door. Large, men's, probably a 10 or 11. Not her foot. She pushed the door open. The room beyond was roughly 15 feet square, concrete walls, concrete ceiling, a ventilation grate near the top of one wall connected to a duct that no longer functioned. Ruth raised the light. Along the left wall were shelves, floor to ceiling, holding rows of metal lockboxes, the kind banks used for documents, and several tightly wrapped parcels in oil-impregnated cloth. On the right wall were racks holding 5 canvas mailbags, the old-style postal service kind, cinched at the top. In the center of the room sat a display table draped in black velvet, and on the velvet, laid out with the careful deliberateness of a museum exhibit, were 12 pocket watches. Ruth was not a collector. She couldn't have told you the difference between a railroad watch and a dress watch, but she had spent 20 years on a mail route that included the home of Edgar Whitfield, Kentucky's most prominent horological appraiser before his death in 2013, who had spent the last decade of his life showing her, once a week, over the course of her route, whichever watch he was currently restoring. You picked things up, spending time around a man like that. She recognized immediately that what was on this table was not ordinary. The watches were different sizes, different metals, gold, silver, 2 in unusual rose gold cases, and even in the flat white light of the utility lamp, they were extraordinary. One, in a hunter case with a heavily engraved back, had an enamel portrait on the interior lid that was clearly not the kind of thing you bought at an estate sale. A hand-typed index card, protected by a scrap of acetate, sat beside them. Ruth leaned close to read it. The Aldrich Coction, acquisition complete 14 Jolly 1988. The watches had been stolen from a traveling Smithsonian exhibition, Timekeepers of the Civil War Era, in August of 1988, lifted from the Lexington Convention Center during a one-night installation gap when the security contractor filed the wrong permit. The theft made national news at the time. 14 Civil War-era watches, several belonging to Union and Confederate generals, collectively valued by the Smithsonian at somewhere north of $3 million. The case had never been solved. The watches had been missing for 38 years. Ruth straightened up slowly and turned toward the mailbags. She opened the nearest one. Inside, packed in dense, neat bricks, were stacks of old currency, bound in the brittle, dried-out rubber bands of a previous generation. She counted the visible bricks in the top layer, multiplied, and stopped multiplying, because the number she was arriving at was not one she could hold in her head without her thinking going slightly sideways. She was still standing there when she heard the footstep in the concrete passage behind her. A single, deliberate footstep, the footstep of someone not trying to conceal his presence. Ruth did not turn around immediately. She gripped the crowbar and the light, took one measured breath and turned. The man in the doorway was in his late 50s, wearing a field jacket over a collared shirt, gray hair pushed back from a broad, slightly flushed face. He was not carrying his firearm in a threatening position. It hung in his right hand, barrel down. But it was there. A compact semi-automatic with an aftermarket suppressor that made it look almost ridiculous, like a clarinet assembled from mismatched pieces. Ruth had seen him before that morning in the auction room, second row, turning around after her bid to look at her with an expression she'd read at the time as mild curiosity. She understood now it had been assessment. His name, she would learn, was Preston Aldrich. She knew the Aldrich name, of course. Everyone in Harlan County did, the Mill family, the old money. The portraits in the courthouse. She had not connected the man in the field jacket to that family. She was connecting it now. "You move fast," Preston said. His voice was conversational, almost warm. The tone of a man not accustomed to situations he didn't control, managing his discomfort through social performance. "Most people, they buy a condemned building, they visit during business hours. Maybe bring a contractor." "The road flooded," Ruth said. "I know." He glanced at the display table and the mailbags, taking a quiet inventory, checking everything was where it should be. "My grandfather built this room in 1941. Concrete poured into the original foundation. Nobody knew it was here. Not my father, not the accountants, not the federal tax people who crawled through this building for 2 years after he died in 1986. He looked at the index card on the velvet table. "My father kept adding to it after that. He never got to see it properly housed either. Neither did I until tonight." "He stole from a museum," Ruth said. Preston made a small gesture with the hand not holding the gun. He facilitated a relocation. He was a practical man. So was my father. "What do you want?" "I've been trying to buy this property for 4 years. He moved into the room, not quickly, not threateningly, but moving, which changed the geometry of the situation in ways Ruth was rapidly calculating. The county kept it in probate assessment because of the environmental backlog. When they finally put it up for sale, I had a purchasing entity ready, an LLC, nothing traceable to the Aldrich name." He paused, and then you raised your hand. "You let me bid it. For $215. Nobody questions a grieving widow buying scrap property. I planned to let you have your copper expedition and come back after you left with an excavator. But you stayed." He reached the far side of the room and stopped, positioning himself between her and the vault door. "And then you found it." "I won't say anything," Ruth said, hearing the desperation in her own voice and not bothering to hide it because it was real. "I need the $215 back for groceries. I need to keep my house. I don't care about any of this. I want to go home." Preston looked at her with something close to genuine sympathy, which was the most frightening thing about him. "That's the problem," he said quietly. "It's not about what you'll say. It's about what you've seen. The watches are documented by Interpol. The currency's traceable if anyone runs the serial ranges. And the bills in those bags," he glanced at the mailbags, "didn't belong to my grandfather to begin with. It belonged to 9 county officials and 2 state legislators who paid him to look the other way on labor violations for 20 years. He kept records of every transaction, every date." He nodded toward the lockboxes. "Some of those names are still active in Frankfurt. Old now, but still very much invested in those records never surfacing." He raised the gun. "I am sorry," he said, and she believed him, which was a cold and terrible thing to believe about a man who was about to shoot her. Ruth thought about Gerald. Not the Gerald of the last 3 months, diminished and frightened in the hospital bed, but the Gerald of every ordinary morning of their ordinary life. Standing at the kitchen counter reading the paper, wearing the flannel shirt with the frayed left cuff, she'd told him 600 times she was going to repair and never did. The torpedo level in his shirt pocket. "Measure twice, cut once, Ruthie. And when you've already made the cut, you don't cry about the measurement. You build with what you've got." Ruth looked at what she had. A crowbar in her right hand, a utility light on her belt. Gerald's level in her coat pocket, and directly to her left, a ventilation grate. The duct behind it no longer functioned, but the grate was a steel grid mortared into a concrete wall, and that wall had a crack running from its upper right corner that she had noticed, without knowing why, when she first walked in. Ruth made her decision in about 1 second. She moved left, not running, not diving, just crossing the room the way you'd cross it to open a window, quick and purposeful, and got her fingers through the grate before Preston had fully registered that she was moving. She yanked. The mortar, set in 1941, had had 85 years to respond to the moisture in a Kentucky hillside, and the crack in the wall told her everything she needed to know about what was left of it. The grate came out with a sound like a rifle shot. Preston fired once, a flat industrial crack that hit the concrete ceiling and filled the room with dust, and lunged. Ruth pivoted, put the grate between them, and slammed its edge into his forearm. The gun hit the floor and skittered toward the shelves. He grabbed for her. She drove the flat of the grate into his chest with both hands, and he went backward into the mailbag racks, tangled and off balance. Ruth was already running. She hit the vault door at speed, got her shoulder behind it, slammed it, and grabbed the wheel with both hands. It resisted for half a second, old, heavy, and then turned, and she kept turning it until the locks set with a sequence of thick, authoritative thuds. She could hear him hitting the door, shouting. She stood in the narrow concrete passage with her back against the vault door, breathing, and reached into her coat pocket to close her hand around the torpedo level. Her hands were shaking. She let them. The door was locked. Ruth walked back through the passage, through the management office, down the stairs, through the dark mill floor to the loading dock. The rain had let up. The road water had dropped, the culvert draining fast now that the worst of the storm had passed. She climbed into the Silverado and started the engine, drove to the end of the access road, and stopped. Then she called 911. She told the dispatcher what she had found, that there was a man locked in a vault beneath the management offices, that his name was Preston Aldrich, that he had fired a weapon at her, and that the vault contained items she believed were connected to a 38-year-old Smithsonian theft case. She gave the address and sat in the truck with the headlights off and the engine running, waiting. The Harlan County Sheriff's Department arrived in 11 minutes. Kentucky State Police arrived 40 minutes after that, followed by a gray SUV with federal plates, whose occupants did not immediately identify themselves, followed by a second federal vehicle and a woman in a blazer, who introduced herself as Special Agent Courtney Bales of the FBI's Art Crime Team, a real division, Ruth learned that night, with a real field presence in the region. They extracted Preston Aldrich from the vault around 1 in the morning. He had broken 2 fingers on his right hand, hitting the wheel mechanism from the inside. He did not speak once he was in custody. He wore the expression of a man already calculating which deal to offer. Agent Bales came to Ruth's truck window as the scene behind her reached full operation. Generators, mobile light towers, evidence tape, a growing cluster of vehicles turning the overgrown parking lot into something surreal. She had the steady, assessing gaze of someone who had stopped being surprised by what people found in old buildings. "The watches are almost certainly the Aldrich collection," she said, without preamble. "We won't have confirmation until they're examined. But based on your description and what my team is seeing, we're highly confident. Mrs. Calloway, do you know if the Smithsonian maintained an active recovery bounty?" Ruth didn't know. "They do. They have continuously since 1989. $2 million for authenticated recovery of the complete collection." She paused. "All 14 pieces appear to be present." Ruth looked straight ahead through the windshield, at the cedar trees and the dark field and the lit-up ruin of the Aldrich mill beyond. "What about the money in the bags?" she asked. "The currency's subject to federal civil forfeiture. We'll analyze the serial ranges. Whatever connects to documented crimes will likely fall under equitable sharing provisions." Bales glanced at her notepad. "The land, though, the 11 acres and the structure, belongs to you under the deed of sale, clean and clear. Even with evidence on the property, the transfer's unaffected. You'll need an environmental attorney for the remediation, but the county runs a cost-share program for historic industrial sites. There are people who can walk you through it." She said a few other things after that, names to contact, timelines, and handed Ruth her card. Ruth put it in her coat pocket next to the torpedo level. 3 weeks later, on a Thursday morning in August, Ruth Ann Calloway sat on the porch of the ranch house on Crossfield Road and looked at the rosebushes Gerald had planted the spring before he got sick, doing surprisingly well considering how little attention anyone had paid them. She held a mug of coffee and a letter from Lloyd's of London, which administered the Smithsonian's recovery bounty through its Heritage Insurance Division. The letter explained, in careful, precise language, that the 14 watches had been authenticated, the full bounty amount verified and transferred, and that they hoped the resolution of this long-standing case brought some measure of satisfaction. $2 million. The foreclosure on Crossfield Road had been withdrawn. Gerald's medical debt was settled. Ruth had an appointment the following week with a contractor to finally look at the kitchen floor she and Gerald had been meaning to fix for 3 years. She had written a check to Kevin, their son, because she wanted to while she could, and because Gerald would have. She had not agreed to talk about what happened in the mill, despite requests from 2 documentary producers and a reporter from Louisville. It didn't feel like a story she needed to tell anyone. It was a story that had happened to her, which was different. The rose bushes needed water. She would get to them after the coffee. She reached into her pocket and held the torpedo level for a moment, feeling its familiar weight, the smooth brass of the casing. Then she put it back, finished her coffee, and went inside to get the garden hose. What would you have done, standing in that vault with a gun pointed at you and nothing left to lose? Drop your answer in the comments. We read every single one. If Ruth's story hit you the way it hit us, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And subscribe to Inherit a Drama, because every week we find the stories that prove ordinary people are capable of extraordinary things when the world leaves them no other choice.